Before this story ends, a school full of children who once laughed at an old, broken dog would learn that the animal they mocked had once carried a wounded platoon out of a valley in Kunar province on nothing but instinct, pain, and love. But that was still ahead. Right now, in a two-bedroom rental on the wrong side of Route 9, all anyone could see was a limping, one-eyed mutt with matted fur and a man who could barely afford the food to feed it. Frank Delaney woke up the way he always did, 3 minutes before his alarm, lying flat on his back with his left hand already reaching for a rifle that had not been in that bed for 6 years. His fingers closed around nothing but a pillow, and for half a second his chest tightened the way it always did, the old muscle memory refusing to accept that the war was supposedly over. He let out a breath through his nose, slow and controlled, a habit from 1,000 pre-dawn patrols, and stared at the water stain on the ceiling that looked, depending on the light, like either Afghanistan or a broken heart. He was 39 years old and his knees sounded like gravel when he swung them out of bed. 11 years in the Army, 4 deployments, 2 of them with the Rangers, and what he had to show for it was a torn rotator cuff that had never healed right, a hearing aid he refused to wear because it made him feel old, and a Department of Veterans Affairs claim that had been sitting in pending review for 14 months. 14 months of phone calls that went nowhere, 14 months of a woman named Deborah in the Cincinnati regional office telling him his file had been flagged for additional documentation, 14 months of watching his savings account shrink to numbers that made his stomach hurt worse than his shoulder did. The trailer he'd rented after the divorce sat on a gravel lot outside of Millbrook, Ohio, a town so small it didn't have its own zip code, just borrowed one from the county seat 12 miles east. The trailer had a propane heater that worked when it felt like it, a refrigerator that hummed loud enough to hear from the porch, and a bathroom sink that dripped no matter how many times he tightened the washer. It wasn't much. But it was his, and more importantly, it was close enough to his daughter's school that he could make the custody schedule work. Lily was 11. She had her mother's dark hair and Frank's stubborn jaw, and she split her weeks between her mother's house in town, a tidy 2-story with a finished basement and a boyfriend named Chad who sold insurance and wore too much cologne, and her father's trailer, which she had once, with the brutal honesty only a child can manage, described as smelling like a campfire that got rained on. Frank hadn't been offended. He'd laughed, actually laughed, one of the few genuine laughs he'd had in months, because she wasn't wrong. The divorce hadn't been ugly, not in the way divorces on television are ugly, with screaming and thrown plates. It had been quiet and exhausting, the kind of ending that comes not from one big betrayal but from 1,000 small erosions. Frank had come home from his last deployment a different man than the one who left, quieter, quicker to anger over nothing, prone to sitting in dark rooms for hours doing nothing at all. His wife, Carol, had tried. He believed that, genuinely believed she had tried for longer than most people would have. But trying only carries a marriage so far when one half of it feels like he's still crouched behind a wall in Helmand province, waiting for a shot that never comes. He didn't blame her. That was the part nobody understood when they offered him sympathy at the hardware store or the VFW hall. He didn't blame Carol for leaving, and he didn't blame the Army for what 4 deployments had carved out of him, and he tried most days not to blame himself either, though that one was harder. What he did blame, with a slow-burning anger that had nowhere good to go, was a system that had trained him to break locks and clear rooms and keep men alive under fire, and then, when his body finally gave out from all of it, handed him a stack of forms and told him to wait. He made coffee in a pot that was older than his marriage had been, instant because the machine's carafe had cracked, and ate 2 eggs standing at the counter because he didn't see the point of sitting down to eat alone. Outside, the gravel lot was quiet except for a rooster 3 trailers down that road with no apparent concept of what time actually was. Frank checked his phone. No missed calls from the VA, no missed calls from anyone. He put the phone in his pocket and went out to check his mail, and that was where the story, though he did not know it yet, actually began. The dog was in the ditch beside his mailbox, half covered in wet leaves, so still that Frank almost mistook the shape for a bag of trash somebody had tossed from a passing truck. It was the smell that stopped him, the wet fur, old blood smell that any veteran recognizes the way a sommelier recognizes a vintage, and he crouched down slowly, the way he'd been trained to approach anything unknown, low and careful, weight on his back leg. The dog lifted its head an inch off the ground. One eye tracked him, brown and wary. The other was clouded white, a old injury scarred over long ago, the fur around it grown back the wrong direction in a stiff whorl of scar tissue. Its ribs showed clean through a coat that had once, judging by the guard hairs, been a rich sable and black German shepherd coloring, but was now matted into ropes and clumps, missing patches along one flank where the skin showed pink and raw. One ear had a notch bitten clean out of it, healed for years. A back leg didn't sit right under the body, cocked at an angle that spoke of an old brake set poorly or not set at all. "Hey," Frank said low, the way he'd have spoken to a spooked local in a doorway. "Easy, I'm not gonna hurt you." The dog didn't growl, it didn't wag either. It just watched him with that one good eye, breathing shallow, and Frank understood immediately that this was not a dog that had learned to trust anyone in a very long time. He thought about walking away. He had every reason to. He had a rent payment due in 6 days and a bank balance that made him wince every time he checked it, and the last thing a man in his position needed was another mouth to feed. He stood up, actually took 2 steps back toward the trailer, telling himself it wasn't his problem, that Millbrook had an animal control officer somewhere, that this wasn't his dog and wasn't going to be his dog. Then the animal made a sound, not a whimper, not a bark. A single low huff through its nose, short and sharp, almost like a cough, and something about the specific, deliberate quality of it made Frank stop in his tracks. It didn't sound like pain. It sounded strange as the thought was, like a command being given, like the dog was telling him something. He turned back around. "All right," he muttered, mostly to himself. "All right, don't get excited about it." It took him 20 minutes to get the dog into the bed of his truck, moving slow, letting the animal see every motion of his hands before he made it, murmuring the whole time in the low, flat voice he used to use on nervous locals who didn't speak English but understood tone just fine. The dog let him lift it, 70-some pounds of muscle and old scar tissue, and didn't so much as bare a tooth, though every line of its body was rigid with the effort of holding still for a stranger's hands. The vet in town, a heavyset man named Dr. Aldous Reyes, who had been patching up farm animals and family pets in Millbrook for going on 30 years, took one look at the dog on his exam table and let out a low whistle through his teeth. "Where'd you find this old soldier?" "Ditch by my mailbox." Dr. Reyes ran his hands along the dog's ribs, checked the clouded eye with a penlight, palpated the crooked back leg while the dog held so still it might have been carved from wood. No collar, no visible tag. Let's see if somebody chipped him. He ran a scanner along the back of the dog's neck, between the shoulder blades, and the machine gave a soft beep. "Well," Reyes said, squinting at the little handheld reader, "that's a chip all right. Old one though. Format's outdated. This'll take some digging to trace." He looked up at Frank. "You want to keep him?" Frank hadn't planned to answer yes. He'd planned, if he was honest with himself, to say he was just trying to do a decent thing, get the animal checked and hand it off to a shelter, wash his hands of it, and go back to worrying about his own problems, which were plentiful enough without adding a broken-down dog to the list. "I don't know," he said instead. "Guess we'll see." That night the dog slept on the trailer's cold linoleum floor, rather than the old quilt Frank had folded into a bed for him by the propane heater, as far from Frank as the small space allowed, watching the door with his one good eye until well past midnight. Frank lay awake in his own bed listening to the dogs breathing through the thin wall, and thought, not for the first time, that he understood exactly what it was to not trust a roof over your head. "You and me both, buddy," he said into the dark, and didn't expect an answer, and didn't get one, but somewhere in the front room he heard the dog's tail thump once, twice, against the linoleum before going still. The days that followed fell into something like a rhythm. Frank named the dog Scout, mostly because Lily suggested it on her first weekend visit and he didn't have a better idea, and because the name suited an animal who spent his first several days in the trailer doing exactly that, scouting, moving room to room with careful, deliberate steps, memorizing exits, positioning himself where he could see both the front door and the kitchen window at once. Frank recognized T. He behavior because it was his own. He'd done the same thing in every new posting he'd ever had, in every fob and safe house and rented apartment since coming home, some deep, unkillable part of his brain cataloging, escape routes and sight lines before he could relax enough to sleep. "You've done this before," he said to the dog one evening, watching Scout take up a position in the trailer's front room that gave him a clear line to both the door and the kitchen, the exact spot Frank himself preferred to sit. "Somebody trained that into you." Scout looked at him with the one good eye, ears swiveling toward his voice, and said nothing, because dogs cannot speak, but the intelligence behind that gaze was unmistakable, sharp, and evaluating in a way that ordinary strays did not possess. Lily fell for the dog immediately and without reservation, the way only an 11-year-old could, kneeling on the trailer floor the first time she met him and holding out her hand palm up, patient as a saint, waiting for him to come to her rather than reaching for him first. It took Scout almost 10 minutes to close the distance, but when he finally did, he pressed his big scarred head into her palm and let out a long, shuddering sigh, and Lily had looked up at her father with an expression of such pure, uncomplicated joy that Frank felt something in his chest crack open a little, something that had been sealed shut a long time. "He's not scary," she announced. "He's just tired." "Yeah," Frank said, watching the dog lean into his daughter's small hand like it was the first kind touch he'd felt in years. "Yeah, I think you're right about that." It was 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday that started ordinary and ended with Frank's hands shaking so badly he had to set his coffee cup down, that Lily came home from school with red eyes and a jaw clenched tight the way her mother's got when she was trying not to cry in front of people. "What happened?" Frank said, not a question, already reading the signs. "Nothing." She dropped her backpack by the door hard enough that something inside it clattered, and went straight to where Scout lay in his usual spot by the heater, and sat down on the floor beside him, burying her face in the ruff of his neck. Frank crouched down to her level, the same slow, deliberate motion he used with the dog, because some instincts don't care whether the frightened creature in front of you has 2 legs or 4. "Lily, tell me." It came out in pieces, the way these things do. A boy named Tyler Bricks, whose father sat on the county council, and whose family had money that showed in his shoes and his backpack, and the particular sneer he'd perfected by the 4th grade, had seen Scout through the fence during pickup, when Frank sometimes brought the dog along on the drive to wait in the truck. Tyler had laughed loud enough for a cluster of other kids to hear and join in, and called Scout the zombie dog, said he looked like something that crawled out of a grave, said only losers who couldn't afford a real dog would keep something so broken and ugly. He said Scout should just be put down, Lily said, muffled into the dog's fur, because he's useless and gross and blind and stupid, and everybody laughed, Dad, everybody laughed at him, and I got so mad I pushed Tyler, and now I have detention and Mom's gonna kill me. Frank felt the anger rise in him, quick and hot, the specific kind of anger that comes from watching someone hurt your child, but he pushed it down the way he'd been trained to push down every reaction that wasn't useful in the moment, because rage wasn't going to fix anything right now, and his daughter needed something steadier from him than fury. "You shouldn't have pushed him," he said gently, "even if he deserved worse than a push, but I understand why you did." "Is he right, though?" Lily lifted her face, and her eyes were wet, and the question in them was bigger than an 11-year-old should have to ask. Is Scout useless? Is he broken? Frank looked over at the dog, who had lifted his scarred head at the tension in the girl's voice, and was watching them both with an expression Frank could have sworn was concern, ears forward, that one clear eye moving between father and daughter like he was trying to work out what was wrong so he could fix it. "No," Frank said, and meant it more than he'd meant almost anything in a long time. "He's not broken. He's scarred. Those aren't the same thing. A scar means you survived something. It doesn't mean you're less than you were. It means you're still here." He wasn't entirely sure, in that moment, whether he was talking about the dog anymore. That night, after Lily had gone to bed in the trailer's small second bedroom, Frank sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen and made a decision that had been circling the back of his mind since the day at Dr. Ray's office. He dug his old cell phone out of a drawer, the one he hadn't used in 2 years, found it D plugged it in and waited for it to charge enough to power on. When it did, he scrolled through a contacts list full of names he hadn't dialed since the army, names attached to men he'd trusted with his life, and then lost touch with the way soldiers do when the war that bound them together finally ends. He stopped on a name, Doc Ferraro. Master Sergeant Anthony Ferraro had been the kennel master for Frank's unit's attached K-9 element during his 3rd deployment, a wiry, foul-mouthed Italian from Staten Island who loved his dogs more than most men loved their own children, and who had retired 2 years before Frank did, taking a civilian job with a veterinary records contractor that worked with the Department of Defense. If anyone could trace an outdated military format microchip, it was Doc Ferraro. Frank called at 9 at night, half expecting no answer, half expecting the number to be dead. It rang 4 times before a gruff voice picked up. "Yeah, who's this?" "Doc, it's Frank Delaney." There was a pause and then a bark of genuine laughter. "Delaney, Jesus H. Christ, I thought you were dead, or in prison, one of the two." "Neither, thankfully. You got a minute? I need a favor, and it's a weird one." He explained it as best he could, the dog in the ditch, the crooked leg, the clouded eye, the outdated chip Dr. Ray's hadn't been able to fully decode with his civilian equipment. He read Doc Ferraro, the chip number off a printout Ray's had given him, the digits and letters in their odd government formatting, and heard the other man go quiet and serious on the other end of the line, the joking tone draining out of his voice. "Say that number again, slower." Frank read it again. There was a long silence, long enough that Frank thought the call had dropped, filled only with the sound of a keyboard clacking somewhere in Staten Island. Frank, Doc Ferrero said finally, and his voice had changed entirely, gone flat and careful in a way Frank recognized from 100 briefings before bad news. You sitting down? I'm sitting down. That chip belongs to a dog named Titan. Military working dog, designation K9 Titan, Belgian Malinois Cross, trained at Lackland, assigned out to a Marine Special Operations Unit back in 2015. Records show he did 2 rotations, one in Helmand, one in a valley in Kunar province I'm not even gonna try to pronounce right, doing explosive detection and patrol work. He paused and Frank could hear him swallow. Frank, I know this dog. Not personally, but I know the story. Everybody in the K9 program knows the story. Titan's the dog from the Sar Canny ambush. Frank's chest went tight and cold because he knew that name. Everyone who'd served in that theater in that window of time knew that name, the way people who'd never set foot in New York still knew the name of a September morning. Doc, he said slowly, that's not possible. Titan died. Everybody knows Titan died in that valley. There's a memorial plaque at Lejeune with his name on it. There's a plaque, Doc Ferrero agreed, because that's what everybody believed happened. Dog went missing after the ambush, presumed killed in the firefight or died of wounds in the mountains. They never recovered a body. Terrain was too hot to send a search team back in for an animal once the wounded Marines were extracted. They wrote him up as killed in action and moved on because that's what you do. He exhaled, long and slow. But if that chip's reading right, and if the dog matches the physical description on file, bad break to the rear left leg, old, healed wrong, plus an eye injury, plus a chunk out of the left ear, then that dog didn't die in that valley 20-some years ago. He just never came home. Frank sat very still at his kitchen table, the pen loose in his fingers, and through the thin wall he could hear Scout's nails click softly against the linoleum as the old dog shifted in his sleep. Doc, he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended, tell me about the ambush. Tell me what he did. And Doc Ferrero told him, in the careful, respectful tone of a man reciting something close to scripture, about a night patrol from 3rd Platoon that had walked into a coordinated ambush in a narrow valley outside a village called Sar Canny. Insurgent fire coming from 3 elevated positions at once, 2 Marines down in the open within the first 30 seconds. The platoon pinned with no cover and casualties mounting, and the radio operator screaming for air support that was 15 minutes out at best. And how the K9 handler, a young corporal who did not survive that night, had released Titan from his lead in the chaos, whether on purpose or because the leash was simply torn from his hand, in the confusion nobody who lived through it could say for certain, and how the dog had not run. Had instead gone forward, into the open ground, toward the wounded, dragging a Marine by the strap of his gear back toward the platoon's PO. Sisson threw a hail of fire that by every reasonable law of physics should have killed him a dozen times over, had done it again for a second wounded man. Had, according to the after-action report Doc Ferrero was reading off his screen in a voice gone tight with old grief, absorbed at least 1 round meant for a corpsman who was working on the wounded in the open, taking the hit across his flank and staying on his feet, staying between the enemy fire and the men he'd been trained his whole short life to protect, until air support finally arrived and broke the ambush, and the survivors were extracted onto helicopters that had no room in the end. For a dog nobody could find in the dark and the smoke and the dying light. 3rd Platoon, Frank said, and his own voice sounded very far away to him. Doc, what unit was that? Says here Marine Special Operations Company, attached element, 3rd Platoon, Task Force. Doc Ferrero stopped talking. Frank heard him inhale sharply on the other end of the line. Frank, isn't that? That's my platoon, Frank said. That's my unit. I was there. I was 20 feet from that corpsman when the dog took that hit for him. I remember him. I remember everybody thinking he'd died out there in the dark, and none of us ever forgave ourselves for not going back for him. And there wasn't time. There wasn't any time. The LZ was hot, and we had our own wounded, and he stopped, because his throat had closed up entirely, and he sat there in his cold trailer kitchen with the phone pressed hard against his ear. 22 years of guilt he hadn't even known he was still carrying, breaking loose all at once. In the front room, Scout lifted his head off his paws. He couldn't have understood the words, but something in the pitch of Frank's voice, something in the sudden electric grief filling the small trailer, brought the old dog up onto his feet and patted him slowly, stiffly into the kitchen doorway, where he stood watching Frank with that single clear eye, ears low, tail giving one uncertain sweep against the doorframe. Frank looked at him, really looked at him, at the crooked back leg that had never healed right because there had been no vet to set it, at the ruined eye, at the notched ear, at every scar that told a story nobody had been left alive to tell, and felt the floor of his understanding shift entirely. You son of a gun, he said, and his voice broke clean in half. You made it out. 22 years and you made it out, and you've been alone this whole time." He got down on the floor, knees be damned, and Scout Titan came to him without hesitation for the first time since he'd found him in that ditch, pressed his scarred head hard against Frank's chest, and Frank wrapped both arms around 70 pounds of scar tissue, an old survival, and cried like he hadn't let himself cry since he was a boy, for the men they hadn't been able to save that night. For the dog they'd left behind and mourned for 22 years without ever knowing he was still out there somewhere, walking wounded through a world that had forgotten him, and for himself a little, for carrying a guilt he hadn't even known the shape of until this exact moment. "Frank," Doc Ferraro's voice said, tinny and distant from the phone still in his hand. "Frank, you still there?" "I'm here," Frank managed. "Doc, I gotta call you back." "Take your time, brother," Doc Ferraro said, and his own voice was thick. "You take all the time you need." The weeks after that phone call were, Frank would later think, some of the strangest and most tender of his life. A slow-motion reckoning between a man and a dog who had both, in their own ways, been left behind by the same war and had somehow, against every reasonable odds, found their way back into the same small trailer on a gravel lot outside Millbrook, Ohio. He didn't tell Lily everything at first. He told her that Scout used to be a soldier, which was true and which was more than enough for an 11-year-old to be thrilled by, and he watched something shift in his daughter's understanding of the old dog, watched her sit up straighter when she talked about him at school, watched pride replace embarrassment in the set of her shoulders. He didn't tell her the rest, the ambush and the men Titan had saved, and the 22 years of not knowing, because some of that felt too large and too raw to hand to a child, at least not yet, at least not all at once. What he did instead was build a routine around the dog, slow and deliberate, the same patient rebuilding process he'd have used to bring a wounded soldier back to strength. Every morning began the same way, a short walk down the gravel road before the sun fully cleared the tree line, Scout moving at his own careful pace, favoring the bad leg but never complaining about it, nose working the cold air with an intensity that spoke of decades of training that had never fully switched off. Frank started leaving little scent game. As for him in the yard, an old habit borrowed from what Doc Ferraro had told him about working dog enrichment, hiding a tennis ball or a strip of jerky somewhere in the weeds, and letting the old dog hunt for it with the same focus he must once have brought to hunting buried explosives in a mountain pass half a world away. Watching him work nose down, tail steady, one clouded eye and one clear eye both fixed on the task, Frank could see, plain as day, the soldier that had been trained into this animal and had never fully left him, no matter how many years of neglect had tried to bury it. There were smaller moments too, the kind that didn't announce themselves as important, but that Frank would later understand had been quietly rebuilding something in both of them, one ordinary afternoon at a time. Scout developed, somewhere in those first weeks, a habit of dropping a single sock, always a sock, never a toy, at Frank's feet whenever he judged that Frank had been sitting too long staring at nothing, and Frank came to understand this as the dog's version of a wellness check, an old soldier's instinct for noticing when a buddy had gone quiet in a way that wasn't good, repurposed now for a man instead of a platoon. The first time it happened, Frank had laughed out loud, a real laugh startled out of him, holding up the damp, balled-up sock and asking the dog what exactly he was supposed to do with it, and Scout had simply stared back at him with that single steady eye until Frank got up and moved, walked to the window, did something, anything, and only then did the dog's tail give its slow, satisfied sweep against the floor, mission apparently accomplished. He ate with an odd formality that made Lily giggle every time she saw it, refusing to touch his food until Frank had sat down himself, some deep-set protocol from a life where working dogs ate only once their handler gave the release, and Frank found himself, more than once, sitting down at an empty table just so the dog would finally eat, muttering under his breath about being outranked in his own kitchen by a 70-pound Belgian Malinois mix who couldn't even see properly out of one eye. There was a particular sound Scout made when he was content, not quite a groan and not quite a sigh, a low rolling exhale through his nose that Frank started calling the all-clear, and he found himself listening for it the way he used to listen for the specific click of a radio confirming a patrol had made it back inside the wire safely. Hearing it meant, for those few seconds, that everything in the world was where it was supposed to be. Frank built him a ramp for the truck bed out of scrap plywood once the cold weather started making the crooked back legs stiffen up worse in the mornings, sanding the edges smooth over 3 evenings at the kitchen table, with Lily supervising and insisting on painting it a garish shade of blue because, in her words, camouflage is boring and Scout deserves something fun. He rearranged the furniture in the trailer's small front room, without really deciding to, until it matched, almost exactly, the defensive sightlines a K9 handler would have wanted for his dog, and only noticed he'd done it one evening when Doc Ferraro, on a video call to check in, glanced past Frank's shoulder at the room behind him and said, quiet and a little rough, "You set that room up exactly the way we used to train handlers to. You didn't even think about it, did you?" Frank hadn't. It had simply felt right, the same unconscious rightness that had once made him check exits in restaurants and sit with his back to walls, except now the habit had a second creature to serve, and somehow that made it feel less like a wound and more like a purpose. There was a Tuesday evening, cold and ordinary, when Frank sat at the kitchen table filling out yet another VA appeal form, the fourth revision of the same 14-month-old claim, his handwriting getting tighter and angrier with each line as he copied medical codes and service dates into boxes too small for the weight of what they represented, and he became aware, gradually, of Scout's chin resting heavy and deliberate across his knee. The old dog having crossed the room without a sound and simply positioned himself there, watching Frank's face with patient, unhurried attention until Frank set the pen down and rested a hand on his head. "You waiting on the government too, huh?" Frank said, and scratched behind the good ear, and Scout huffed that short, sharp breath through his nose that Frank had come to recognize by now as something close to agreement. "Yeah, me too, buddy, me too." There was a night 3 weeks into this new arrangement, when the whole trailer shook with a summer thunderstorm rolling hard off the flatlands, lightning cracking close enough that the windows rattled in their frames, and Frank woke to a sound he hadn't heard before, a low, continuous whine coming from the front room, edged with something close. To panic, he found Scout wedged into the narrow gap between the couch and the wall, body pressed as small as 70 pounds of dog could make itself, shaking so hard his claws clicked against the floor, that one clear eye rolling white-trimmed with terror at every flash of lightning through the thin curtains. Frank understood immediately, because he'd had nights like this himself, nights where a slammed car door or a burst of fireworks sent him diving for cover on instinct before his conscious mind could catch up and tell him he was safe, that the war was over, that nobody was shooting at him in a Kroger parking lot in Ohio. He didn't reach for the dog. He'd learned enough in his short time with him to know that startling a panicking animal, even one that trusted you, could go badly for both of you. Instead, he sat down on the floor, several feet away, back against the couch, and started talking, low and steady, the same tone he'd have used to talk a rattled private through his first firefight. "I know," he said as thunder rolled overhead again and Scout flinched hard. "I know, buddy. Sounds like the real thing, doesn't it? Sounds exactly like it." He kept his voice even, unhurried. "It's not, though. It's just weather, just Ohio being loud. Nobody's shooting. Nobody's coming through that door." He talked for a long time, about nothing in particular, about the weather and the gravel lot and the Rooster 3 trailers down that had no concept of what time it was, letting the sound of a calm human voice do the work that words alone couldn't, until slowly, inch by inch, Scout's shaking eased and his breathing slowed and he crept, low to the ground, out from behind the couch and across the floor until he was pressed against Frank's side. Close enough that Frank could feel the last tremors working their way out of the old dog's body. "There you go," Frank murmured, finally letting one hand rest on the scarred flank, feeling the heartbeat under his palm slow toward something normal. "There you go. We're okay. Both of us, we're okay." They sat like that until the storm passed, man and dog both awake long past when the thunder had faded to a distant grumble, neither one willing to be the first to move, and Frank thought, staring at the water-stained ceiling in the dark, that he had not felt this understood by another living creature in longer than he could remember. Somewhere in the past weeks, without either of them quite planning it, they had started keeping each other's watch. There was a morning, not long after, when Frank found a deep gash along Scout's uninjured flank, torn open on a rusted fence wire during one of their walks, deep enough to need attention, but not deep enough to warrant an emergency trip to Dr. Ray's. Frank sat the dog down on a towel spread across the kitchen table and cleaned the wound himself with the same careful, practiced hands that had once packed field dressings onto worse injuries under far worse conditions, talking the whole time in that same low, steady voice. "This is gonna sting," he warned, before the antiseptic touched the raw edges of the cut, and Scout held stone still, not so much as a whimper, watching Frank's face with an expression of complete, unquestioning trust that undid something in Frank's chest all over again. Good boy, that's it, almost done." He wrapped the wound with a clean bandage, taped it snug but not tight, and sat back to look at his work, and Scout leaned forward and licked his hand once, gently, and Frank had to blink hard and look away for a second before he trusted himself to speak. "You used to do this for men, didn't you?" he said quietly. "Pull them out of the fire and never ask for a thing back. Guess it's somebody's turn to do it for you." It was on a Thursday evening in late October, the trailer lot gone gold and rust-colored with the turning leaves, that the trouble started. Frank had noticed the car 3 times over the past week, a dark blue sedan that idled a little too long at the end of the gravel road, windows tinted just enough to keep the driver's face unclear, always gone by the time he walked out to check. He hadn't thought much of it at first, told himself it was somebody's confused GPS or a neighbor's visitor who'd taken a wrong turn, but on the fourth night, Scout's behavior told him something different. The old dog had been lying in his usual spot by the door when he suddenly rose, slow and silent, every line of his body gone rigid with focus. He didn't bark. He never barked, Frank had noticed, not once in the months they'd been together, whether out of some old training or some old damage that had burned the instinct out of him. Instead, he walked to the door and sat, perfectly straight-backed, staring at the wood with an intensity that made the hair on Frank's arms rise, and then he lifted one front paw and set it down again, once, deliberate, a single soft tap against the floor. Frank had seen that exact motion cribbed once years ago in a briefing on detection dog behaviors, a trained passive alert, the kind bred and drilled into working dogs so they could signal a threat without giving away their handler's position with noise. Scout wasn't reacting to a smell or a sound the way an ordinary dog would. He was reporting something, and whatever training had put that alert into him 22 years ago had never, in all this time, worn off. Frank killed the kitchen light and moved to the window without a sound, old habits sliding back into place like they'd never left, and watched the dark sedan idle at the end of the gravel road for a long moment before its headlights swung away and it pulled off into the night. He didn't sleep well after that. Over the following days, he started paying closer attention to things he'd let slide past unnoticed in the fog of just trying to get through each week. A manila envelope left in his mailbox with no return address, containing a single sheet of paper, an official-looking county letterhead, notice about a proposed dangerous and nuisance animal ordinance, scheduled for a vote, with a paragraph highlighted in yellow marker describing criteria that, Frank realized with a slow, cold feeling, matched Scout almost exactly. Dogs with a documented history of aggression, dogs exhibiting unpredictable behavior around children, dogs deemed by county assessment to pose a risk to public safety. There was no aggression history. Scout had never so much as growled at a soul. Frank remembered, with sudden clarity, a conversation overheard secondhand from another parent at Lily's school about how Tyler Bricks's father, County Councilman Warren Bricks, had been telling anyone who'd listen that the feral-looking dog one of his son's classmates kept around was a menace that needed to be put down before it hurt somebody, and how the councilman happened to sit on the very committee drafting this ordinance. Frank sat at his kitchen table that night with the letter in front of him and felt the old, familiar click of a mission coming into focus, the specific mental gear shift that had once meant the difference between coming home and not. Somebody with money and a council seat wanted his dog gone, badly enough to be running a surveillance car past his trailer at night, and Frank Delaney had spent 11 years learning exactly how to find out why. He started the way he'd been trained to start any investigation, with public records. The county clerk's office kept meeting minutes and financial disclosures on file, technically open to any resident who asked, though the clerk on duty, a tired young man named Pete who clearly wasn't paid enough to care about the request, seemed surprised anyone actually wanted them. Frank spent 2 evenings at the trailer's kitchen table, Scout curled at his feet with that watchful one-eyed alertness, working through pages of county council financial disclosures, campaign contribution filings, and zoning board minutes with the same patient, methodical attention he'd once given to intelligence reports. What he found took shape slowly, the way these things always do, a pattern emerging out of 100 small, individually unremarkable details. Warren Bricks, it turned out, sat not only on the county council, but also on the board of a nonprofit called the Heartland Veterans Housing Initiative, an organization that had, over the past 3 years, received close to $2 million in state and federal grant money earmarked for building transitional housing for homeless and at-risk veterans in the county. Frank had heard of the organization vaguely, had even seen a billboard for it on the drive into town, a photograph of a smiling veteran shaking hands with a man Frank now recognized, with a sinking feeling, as Councilman Bricks himself. Except when Frank cross-referenced the county's land records, the address listed for the initiative's flagship housing project, 12 units of supposed transitional housing that had been under construction for going on 2 years according to the nonprofit's own annual reports, turned out to correspond to an empty lot on the edge of town, weeds grown up through cracked concrete, no construction equipment, no permits filed with the county in the past 18 months. The money, according to the disclosures Frank could piece together, had gone somewhere. It just hadn't gone into any housing. He called Doc Ferrero again, not because his old friend had any particular expertise in nonprofit fraud, but because Frank needed to talk it through with somebody who'd understand exactly why his hands were shaking as he laid it all out. "You're telling me," Doc Ferrero said slowly, once Frank had walked him through the whole thing, "that some county bigshot skimmed veterans' housing money, and now he wants your dog put down because your dog happened to notice him casing your trailer." "That's what it looks like," Frank said. "I think Bricks is scared I'm gone. Find exactly what I just found. I think his kid mouthing off at my daughter about Scout being useless was probably nothing, just a rich kid being a jerk, but it put Scout on Brix's radar, and once he found out Scout used to be attached to a Marine unit, used to be trained," he stopped, working it through as he said it. "I think he's worried Scout's been trained to detect things, documents, money, even if there's cash involved somewhere. He doesn't know the dog can't do that kind of work anymore, not with his leg and his eye the way they are, but he doesn't know that for sure, and a man hiding $2 million doesn't take chances." "Jesus, Frank," Doc Ferrero exhaled hard. "You gotta take this to somebody. The county sheriff, the state attorney general's office, somebody. This isn't a solo op." "I know," Frank said. "I'm going to. I just wanted it airtight first. I've seen what happens when you go to people with half a story and no proof. They write you off as a conspiracy nut, and the real thing keeps right on going." He spent the following week building his case the way he'd have built a target package overseas. Methodical, sourced, cross-checked twice before he trusted a single fact. He filed public records requests for the nonprofit's full grant disbursement history. He drove out to the supposed construction site and photographed the empty, weed-choked lot from the public road, careful to document the date and location. He found, through an old Army buddy now working as a paralegal in Columbus, a contact at the state attorney general's public corruption unit who agreed, cautiously, to take a look at what Frank had compiled, if he could get it to her properly documented. There were nights during that stretch when Frank sat up until 2 in the morning with the kitchen table covered in printouts, spreadsheets he'd taught himself to build from scratch because he didn't trust himself to keep it all straight in his head. Scout stretched across his feet under the table with that old sentry stillness, ears twitching at every car that passed out on the county road. He cross-referenced board meeting minutes against invoice dates, found 3 separate line items where the nonprofit had paid a construction subcontractor called Bricks Grading and Excavation, a company that, when Frank pulled its state registration, turned out to be owned by Warren Bricks's brother-in-law, with no employees on record and no equipment registered to its name anywhere in the county. He found a second shell entity, this one registered to a P.O. box 2 towns over, that had received 4 separate consulting fee payments totaling just under $300,000 for services the nonprofit's own annual report described only vaguely as strategic development support. He called the paralegal friend in Columbus 3 more times that month, reading numbers off to her over a bad phone connection, while Lily did homework at the other end of the table, and Scout lay between them like a soft, watchful sandbag, and each time she told him the same thing: keep documenting, keep it clean, don't confront anybody directly. Let people whose job this actually was build the case properly so it couldn't be torn apart later by a good defense attorney. Frank understood the wisdom in that, even as it chafed against every instinct in him that wanted to drive straight to Warren Bricks's front door and lay every printed page out on his dinner table. Instead, he drove out to the empty lot twice more, once in daylight and once at dusk, photographing the weeds pushing up through the cracked concrete pad from 3 different angles, timestamping everything, noting the complete absence of any construction equipment, any permit postings, any sign whatsoever that $2 million of promised veteran housing had ever been more than words on a grant application. He requested, through the state's public records portal, copies of every building permit filed under the Heartland Veterans Housing Initiative's name for the past 3 years, and received back, after a 2-week wait that tested every ounce of patience he had left, a grand total of 0 results. It was Dr. Reyes, of all people, who gave him the piece that finally tied it together cleanly, mentioning offhand one afternoon, while checking Scout's leg, that his own brother worked in the county assessor's office and had grumbled once, months back, about a property reassessment request on that same empty lot that had gotten fast-tracked through in a way that skipped several usual steps, a favor the brother had assumed at the time, for somebody with pull on the council. Frank filed a records request for the assessor's file within the hour, and there, buried in a stack of routine paperwork, was Warren Bricks's own signature, approving an internal reassessment that had quietly lowered the lot's official value. The same week, Frank noted, with his stomach going tight and cold, that a construction progress payment of $400,000 had been drawn down from the grant account and transferred out to the shell company with the P.O. box. By the time he finally packaged everything for his contact at the Attorney General's office, The folder ran to nearly 60 pages, financial records and property records and photographs, and a careful, dispassionate summary written in the same flat, factual style he'd once used for after-action reports, because he'd learned, over 11 years, that the truth needed no embellishment to be damning. It only needed to be laid out clearly enough that nobody could argue with it. He almost had it all together, one final piece away from being ready to hand over, when the trouble stopped being quiet. It happened on a Friday night in early November, cold enough that Frank had the propane heater running full blast and Scout curled tight against it, when the old dog came awake all at once, head snapping up, body going rigid in that same silent, focused alert Frank had learned to take seriously. No barking. Just the single deliberate paw tap against the floor, and then, this time, something new. Scout rose and moved to the kitchen window, placed both front paws carefully on the sill, and stared out into the dark with an intensity that raised every hair on the back of Frank's neck. Frank killed the lights without a word and moved to the window beside him, and in the thin moonlight he could make out two figures moving along the tree line at the edge of his property, moving with the deliberate, unhurried care of men who didn't want to be seen, one of them carrying something long and dark against his leg that Frank's trained eye read, with a cold drop in his stomach, as a length of pipe or a bat. Thought fast, the old training taking over completely now, no room left for fear, only assessment and action. Lily was at her mother's this weekend, thank God, one less variable to protect. He had no firearm in the trailer, a condition of his custody agreement he'd never regretted until this exact moment, but he had a maglite heavy enough to double as a weapon in a pinch, and he had 11 years of hand-to-hand training that didn't evaporate just because a man got older and slower. And he had Scout, who was already moving toward the front door with a low, coiled purposefulness that told Frank the old dog's training had never actually left him at all, that whatever gentle, wounded creature had been living in his trailer for the past several months, there was still underneath it a soldier who knew exactly what an approaching threat looked like and exactly what he was supposed to do about it. Stay with me, Frank breathed, and eased the front door open rather than waiting for it to be forced, because the element of surprise belonged, in this moment, to the man who chose when the confrontation started, not the men creeping through the tree line hoping to catch him asleep. The cold hit him first, sharp and clean, and then the two figures froze at the edge of the yard as the door swung open, clearly not expecting to find their target already awake and already outside. Frank took them in fast. Two men, one heavyset and slow-moving, the one with the pipe, the other leaner and quicker, hanging back a half step in the way of a man more comfortable giving orders than executing them. Evening, Frank said, and kept his voice level, almost conversational, the specific calm that unsettles people more than shouting ever could. Help you gentlemen with something. The heavyset one hesitated, pipe still low against his leg, clearly recalculating now that surprise was off the table. The leaner one found his voice first. This doesn't concern you if you just hand over the dog. We're not here to hurt you, just here for the animal. County's putting him down anyway once the ordinance passes. We're just saving everybody the paperwork. Funny, Frank said, because I don't recall the county sending armed men to collect a dog scheduled for a legal process. That sounds less like animal control and more like somebody trying to make a problem disappear before it gets in front of a judge. He saw the flicker of surprise cross the leaner man's face, the confirmation that Frank had, in fact, worked out exactly what this was about, and beside him he felt Scout's body coil tighter, weight shifting forward onto his good legs, that one clear eye fixed unblinking on the heavyset man with the pipe. Last chance, the lean man said, and something in his voice had gone harder now, done pretending this was a friendly conversation. Hand him over. No, Frank said simply. The heavyset man moved first, exactly the mistake Frank had been hoping for, closing the distance in a rush with the pipe already swinging up, and everything after that happened in the compressed, adrenaline-slowed clarity that Frank hadn't experienced since his last deployment, muscle memory taking over faster than conscious thought. He stepped inside the sea of the swing rather than back from it, closing the distance so the pipe lost all its leverage, and drove the heel of his hand up under the man's jaw with the same economical, brutal efficiency he'd been trained to use against far more dangerous opponents, dropping him hard onto the cold ground with the pipe clattering away into the dark. The lean man lunged for him from the side, but he never got the chance to close the distance, because Scout moved first, a blur of scarred muscle and old, unforgotten training, closing the gap in 3 bounding strides despite the crooked leg, and hit the man high on the shoulder with enough force to spin him sideways off balance, jaws closing on the padded sleeve of his jacket with the controlled, disciplined bite of an animal trained to incapacitate rather than maim, holding on with a grim, silent tenacity, even as the man swore and thrashed and tried to shake him loose. Frank was on the second man in the next second, using his weight and training to pin him face down against the frozen grass, one knee driving hard between his shoulder blades, and it was over almost as quickly as it had started, both intruders down and immobilized, one groaning on the ground clutching his jaw, the other still pinned under Scout's disciplined, unrelenting grip until Frank gave a low command, out. That he had no real expectation would mean anything to a dog he'd known for a matter of months. Scout released instantly, backing off with military precision, taking up a watchful position a few feet away, hackles still raised, one clear eye locked on the downed men in case either made another move. He listens to commands, Frank said aloud, mostly to himself, stunned despite everything else happening in that frozen yard. After 22 years, he still listens. He had both men zip-tied with a spare set of flex cuffs he'd kept in his truck since his last deployment out of some old habit he'd never bothered to examine, and the county sheriff's department, once summoned, took considerably less convincing than Frank had expected, because it turned out Frank's contact at the state attorney general's office had, in fact, already begun quietly cross-referencing the Heartland Veterans Housing Initiative's financials with a similar complaint filed by a contractor in a neighboring county, and Councilman Warren Bricks's name had already surfaced more than once in that inquiry before Frank's package ever landed on anyone's desk. The two men, once properly questioned, gave up Bricks's name with the particular speed of hired muscle, who had never signed up to be charged with assault and attempted animal theft in service of somebody else's fraud. And within 6 weeks, what had started as a ditch-side rescue of a broken, discarded dog had unraveled into a full state investigation, culminating in Warren Bricks's indictment on counts of grand theft, wire fraud, and misappropriation of federal grant funds. The empty weed-choked lot on the edge of town finally photographed and entered into evidence as exhibit after exhibit of a housing project that had never existed anywhere but in a nonprofit's glossy annual reports. The dangerous and nuisance animal ordinance quietly died in committee a week after Bricks's arrest, nobody left with the appetite to push it forward. Justice, when it came slow and procedural and entirely without drama, exactly the way Frank had hoped it would, through subpoenas and grand juries, and a plea deal that would eventually see Warren Bricks serve 4 years in a federal facility and repay, over time, what could be recovered of the stolen grant money toward actual veteran housing built under new, closely monitored oversight. There was no dramatic courtroom showdown, no final violent confrontation beyond that one frozen night in the yard, just paperwork finally doing the slow, honest work it was supposed to do all along. The story got out, as these things do in small towns, first through whispers at the diner, and then, eventually, through an article in the county paper with the headline "Local Veteran and His Military Working Dog Uncover Corruption, Recover Stolen Veterans Funds," accompanied by a photograph Frank hadn't even known was being taken, of him kneeling in his yard with one arm around Scout's scarred neck, both of them looking tired and a little stunned and entirely, unmistakably at peace. The Marine Corps, once Doc Ferrero's channels confirmed through official record verification that the dog once presumed killed in action at Sarkany was in fact alive and identified beyond doubt, arranged a small ceremony at a base 2 hours from Millbrook. Nothing grand, no press beyond the local paper, just a handful of officers and a retired colonel who had commanded the unit back in the day, standing in a modest room with a folded flag and a formal certificate acknowledging. 22 years late, K9 Titan's official status, found, alive, honorably retired, credited posthumously turned AC. Tooley with the actions that had saved 4 Marines' lives in a valley, whose name most of the room could still barely pronounce without their voices catching. They offered Frank money, a modest sum from a veteran's charity moved by the story, and a formal offer to cover the dog's ongoing medical care for the rest of his life, which Frank accepted gratefully, because Scout's leg and eye weren't going to get any younger and good veterinary care wasn't free. But when the retired colonel, a graying man with kind eyes and a handshake like iron, asked Frank quietly after the ceremony what he really wanted out of all this, Frank had to think about it for a long moment before he answered. "Just this," he said finally, looking across the room to where Lily knelt beside Scout, who wore, for the ceremony, a small handmade cape she'd sewn herself out of an old army green t-shirt, entirely unnecessary and entirely perfect, and who sat with his crooked leg tucked under him, and his scarred head held high, patient and dignified, while a line of Marines took turns crouching down to shake his paw like he was the most important person in the room, which, in a way that mattered more than any medal, he was, just this, a quiet life, a kid who loves him, somewhere warm to sleep that isn't a ditch. That's all either of us ever really wanted. The bullying at Lily's school stopped almost entirely once the story spread, not because anyone forced an apology, but because 11-year-olds, it turned out, cared a great deal about whose dog had secretly been a war hero, and Tyler Bricks, whose own father's disgrace had become the talk of the entire county, had considerably bigger things to worry about than mocking somebody else's pet. Lily never gloated about it, not once, which made Frank prouder of her than almost anything else in this whole strange chapter of their lives. She just started walking Scout up to the fence at pickup again, head high, unbothered, letting the other kids who wanted to pet the old dog's scarred head do so, one by one, patient and gentle the way she'd learned to be from watching her father learn the same thing all over again. Winter came properly to Millbrook not long after, the gravel lot going white and quiet under a real snow, and on the evenings when Lily wasn't there, it was just Frank and Scout in the small trailer, the propane heater ticking softly, the old dog stretched out on his quilt by the warmth with his crooked leg extended, and his breathing slow and even at peace in a way that took Frank's breath away every time he really looked at him. Frank still had his own hard nights, still woke sometimes with his hand reaching for a rifle that wasn't there, still carried more than he'd ever fully unpack in one lifetime. But he wasn't carrying it alone anymore, and neither, for the first time in 22 years, was the old soldier curled up asleep beside the heater, home at last, however long it had taken to get there. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved me putting it together, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories like Frank and Scout's. Subscribe if you're new here, because there are a lot more veterans and a lot more good dogs waiting to have their stories told. Drop a comment and let me know what part hit you hardest. I read every single one. And if you know somebody who needs a reminder that broken doesn't mean worthless, do them a favor and send this one their way. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.